Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back in to bring you the Holy Priest Guide for Dragonflight Season 1. With this, we'll be talking about two different raid builds, as well as the primary Mythic Plus build, going over some of the talent variations, why they work certain ways, how to be able to perform when you want to utilize them, and a whole lot more. If you'd like to support this content, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below, and of course check out the live stream, as we're going to be doing plenty of both Holy and Discipline content. If you're interested in the written versions of the guides for a bit more explanation, check those out, also in the description down below. First and foremost, we're going to start with the talents for raiding for Holy. Specifically, there's two different builds that you would likely be utilizing. There is the AoE build, it's like the overflowing words, I like to call it, where you're utilizing Apotheosis procs from Prayer of Mending casts and uses, and you're pooling together multiple charges of your holy words and pumping out a lot of AoE healing in between. This build is really good for a variety of encounters in Vault of the Incarnates, because there's just generally a lot of raid-wide damage, and there's not as many like single target focused mechanics going out. There's not a lot of like individually really heavy dots that are frequently going out. There's a couple here and there, but it's not as omnipresent as some other encounters that we've had in other raid instances in the past. The other build is going to be a very single target oriented build, which is great if you're not running like Prot Warriors, for example, and you actually need to heal your tanks. But of course, a lot of World First guilds are running the best tanks, and they're a lot stronger and don't really need as much healing support as other raid tiers that we've had in the past. And the single target builds can do pretty well, especially if you don't really have anybody in your group like a paladin who's going to spend a large amount of your time single target healing, or if that paladin is going to need like a little bit of extra help in certain areas. That single target build is still viable and still very good. My primary recommendation, however, would be to utilize the AoE build more frequently, and we'll talk about some different use cases for where you might want to switch off to that when we start breaking down the individual talents. This build as follows is the very AoE oriented build. Like I mentioned before, you're taking all of these permitting talents all the time for single target or for AoE, but they feed into answered prayers, which gives you procs of Apotheosis to give you more cooldown reduction at random different times. Now, you're not always going to get good value out of casting, say, Prayer of Healing with this Apotheosis, but when you take Harmonious Apparatus, you're almost always getting a lot of value out of the Apotheosis procs, because you're bound to have Circle of Healing or Prayer of Mending off cooldown during the duration of that Apotheosis, or at least you will on average. And so what Miracle Worker allows you to do is to not lose out on any additional Holy Word cooldown reduction that you get, in case you're close to getting Sanctify back or close to getting Serenity back, and then you get an Apotheosis proc. This allows you to greater pool up your resources and then be able to not waste any cooldown reduction, which can then allow you to have faster access to your salvations. It can kind of allow you to pool up holy words if there's going to be high movement, which is a lot of in this raid. And it just generally allows you to heal more efficiently, because your holy words are also going to be free during your Apotheosis uptime, which means if you're able to get holy word casts off during Apotheosis, you're going to have a lot more mana to spend when you want to cast lots of Prayer of Healing to be able to heal people. When utilizing Prayer of Healing on its own, it's pretty weak, but with Circle of Healing and the Prayer Circle talent, you can reduce the cost and reduce the cast time. With the Sanctified Prayers talent, after you cast Sanctify, your follow-up Prayer of Healings are also going to be 15% stronger. So it's recommended that during Prayer of Healing, or when casting Prayer of Healing, you're always going to have one of those buffs at your disposal to utilize, so that you're going to be as efficient as you possibly can. Some of the other support talents, for example, Prismatic Echoes is not that great, but again, you don't want to really be taking single target talents to get access to salvation. Desperate Times is alright, but there's not too many moments where people are sub 50% for a long period of time. Healers are a lot more burstier, they're a lot more powerful this expansion, and so players don't really linger at low health for long periods of time. Light of the Naru is also a pretty solid talent option you can have access to. Restitution, right here at the bottom, is pretty good for learning mechanics and being able to just survive. You can even pair it up with Afterlife, and if you die, you can res somebody else for free with a battle res, and then be able to resurrect yourself in the process. Those are really good, but you do lose out on a good amount of output by missing Miracle Worker's 2-charge system, because there's a lot of moments where you're kind of waiting for the next big hit, especially on fights like Razagath or even like Dathia as well, where you're kind of waiting for the next mechanic. You don't really have a use for that Holy Word, and you would potentially overcap if you only had 1 charge each. And that's where Miracle Worker kind of saves you a lot of your resources and gets you started on regenning the next Holy Word, even if one is already off cooldown. From the class tree perspective, there'll be some moments where you'll want to have Dispel Magic. Overall, the use for Phantasm is like Senarth, basically. There'll be a couple times you're going to mix around some of the different talent options that you have at your disposal. You're not always going to need Improved Mass Dispel, although it's pretty good on Broodkeeper, or it's pretty good on Razagath. So there'll be a time and a place to utilize these. Improve Fade is one of your best options outside of like the regular capstones. You can even get rid of Mind Games and Throws of Pain if you don't want to deal as much damage, and go into things like Light's Inspiration. Angelic Bulwark, not very good, but it's something. So keep that in mind, that you want to make sure you're having a lower cooldown on Fade first. You want to make sure you're getting like Light's Inspiration first to have access to. You can also go into Chastise, Burning Vehemence, MP Blaze, all those things to add more damage, but keep in mind it's not going to be in like a standard build. You'll be looking for, hey, there's a lot of downtime, we need a lot more boss damage, let me spec into this, and you can do so fairly cheaply without really pushing down too much of your output. Lastly, Gales of Song. This ability is situationally really good, but there's moments where it's not as impactful. Having an additional 10% healing buff that you can apply to the entire raid at a time is wonderful, but there's moments where you'll Divine Hymn, and there's not really any follow-up damage that goes into it. Razagath has a couple phases like that, where you'll Hymn for like a knockback into Sparks, and you get a healing buff, and it feels really good. And there's other moments like Dathia, where you get sucked in from the Cyclone, you'll heal up that damage, and then there's nothing for a while, and you're not benefiting enough from Gales of Song. So those points could be dumped into something like Desperate Times, they could be dumped into things like Afterlife, more damage, depending on the situation that you have. Similarly, when you're playing in a single target build, you're going to be taking advantage of Lightweaver for the builder-spender gameplay of casting a Flash Heal, getting a healing buff, casting that healing buff, consuming the buff. You're not playing like maintenance like Flash Concentration anymore if you're coming in from Shadowlands. Instead, it's going to be all about single target output all the time. As I mentioned previously, Prismatic Echoes, Rapid Recovery, Empowered Renew, all of these are like not very good. It's not as valuable to go into like Answered Prayers and Miracle Worker, because Divine Word is a really powerful cooldown to have access to. And whether you're playing single target or you're playing AoE, you're almost always going to be using it on Sanctifies to be able to make that healing field, which nets out a massive amount of output. And when you're playing a single target build, you can almost always net your Sanctifies and Divine Words together, but it kind of gets thrown off from Harmonious Apparatus. So if you don't have Sanctify nearby, you can always use Divine Word for single target with Serenity, allowing you to bust out a large amount of powerful flash heals that'll crit more often, heal more, cost less, the works. And it does extremely, extremely well. Same thing goes wrong with Gales of Song. You can flex this around if you're not having a lot of consistent output to follow you up. The Prayer of Mending talents are always a must because there's high movement. Prayer of Mending is incredibly efficient. It's really, really good value to be able to have the high passive healing going when you have to run and move around for different mechanics. And those are really going to be some of the mechanics that help carry you through some of the more challenging encounters when you have to run around all of the time. Whenever you're playing in a raid environment, generally I would recommend mixing around the AoE build, at least to start, as you go into new fights. The focus for you is going to be on using your Prayer of Mending on cooldown, Circle of Healing on cooldown, Serenity for single target healing, Sanctify for AoE healing, and using Divine Word with Sanctify as long as you're going to be able to have people staying in that field that it gets dropped on a fairly consistent basis. With this, your focus is going to be on using Prayer of Healing primarily when you have a Prayer Circle buff after using Circle of Healing, or a Sanctified Prayers buff after using Holy Word Sanctify. It's not always going to work out that way, but one of the talents you have access to, I believe, is called Orison, which gives you 3 seconds of cooldown reduction for your Circle of Healing and makes it hit an additional target. This ability is fantastic for consistently allowing you to have access to Circle of Healing, getting more Sanctify cooldown reduction thanks to Harmonious Apparatus, and giving you a lot of Prayer Circle uptime all at once. And so with this, you can be very aggressive with your Prayer of Healing usage, and you can even hold on to Circle of Healing a little bit here and there, just to allow you to have a wide variety of moments where you can cast unfettered amounts of Prayer of Healing to just spread Echo and spread your healing all over the place. While your Echo of Light is going to stack if you keep on Prayer of Healing targets, so you don't have to worry about overlapping. That's just a long-running myth. You do want to make sure you're sort of spreading around the love and not just Prayer of Healing one group of people all of the time until they're 100% HP. Whenever there's large amounts of AoE damage, I do like to go towards the most vulnerable targets and spread around the Prayer of Healing, and also make sure that you are being mindful of range versus melee and where people might be positioned, because that'll also give you a greater level of efficiency for your overall output. When it comes to Divine Word, as I mentioned previously, almost always you want to make sure you're using it for for Sanctify, but you can use it for Chastise if you spec into it to deal a lot of damage. This can be good on encounters where maybe you're overhealing or there are certain damage checks that you need to be able to reach. It can be a really good addition, and it doesn't really cost you a lot of additional output to be able to get that job done. From a single target perspective, similar to M+, which we'll talk about in a moment, you're having your Builder Spender with Flash Shield into heal, still using your Prayer of Mending, Circle of Healing, Holy Words on cooldown, the like. And again, it's all about that triage. Powered Life does a great job of being able to triage your allies and being able to efficiently heal them. A lot of times I'm doing about as much healing out of Serenity in an AoE build as I am out of Powered Life. That said, both the builds are going to be very powerful. It just depends on how much you really need to be able to spam individual players to be able to top them from the debuffs that they're taking. Usually it'll depend to me, involves the Incarnates, about how much I really need to heal the tanks. And overall, from having double Prot Warrior in this raid, it doesn't seem like I need to heal them a lot, but if you're running with other tanks or just not as good of tanks, and they're going to need a lot more support, the single target build is 100% A-OK, fine to run. Next up, I wanted to talk about the Holy build for Mythic Plus. There are going to be some moments like in Shadow of Burial Grounds where you're going to need Disease Dispels. Phantasm is really good for removing that as well. Inspiration is really good in general to run, but I just got off a bursting week where I needed the improved Mass Dispel, so those are some talents that you can always move around, and I'll have the links to all these guide imports in the description down below, so make sure that you check that out as well if you want to just get a quick access on hand. For the right side, the spec tree, you're always wanting Trail and the single target pathing. You don't really care about Prismatic Echoes, and so with those points, you can instead take Divine Hymn and Circle of Healing. These are okay abilities, but when you're playing Lightweaver, whether it's raids, whether it's Mythic Plus, you are pretty much not using Prayer of Healing ever. It's just not very efficient. You're not taking advantage of the Prayer Circle or Sanctified Prayers buffs or any of that other stuff, so it's not as efficient to be going after that. The way to think about it is that the single target healing has 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different buffs, probably 8 really, 8 different talents that are specifically focusing on single target output all the time. And if you're not speccing into any of the other resources like Orison, Prayer Circle, Sanctified Prayers, you're not finding ways to buff up your Prayer of Healing output. And so as a result, you're not going to be as efficient and as effective utilizing Prayer of Healing, and so therefore you should almost never use it, or pretty much never use it. Whether it's a Lightweaver 5-man build or a Lightweaver raid build, when you're not running Prayer of Healing synergistic talents, don't cast that ability. For the AoE build and raids, you can cast some heal as filler, but otherwise you're not taking any single target talents, so don't worry about casting a lot of single target. Again, Divine Hymn and Circle of Healing are not really going to top people in an AoE environment on their own. They're kind of just extra abilities to support you. Circle of Healing is good to use on the move. Divine Hymn is good to use before damage happens to take advantage of the increased healing buff, the 20% healing buff that can stack onto your allies. That kind of stuff helps a lot, but you're not really using it primarily to AoE heal. When it comes to Prayer of Mending in a 5-man environment, it's good to utilize on boss fights, but you're not really using it on a lot of trash packs because most of the time it's like tank pressure and then random other single target damage going out that you can't really control where Prayer of Mending is going to bounce. As usual for the talent perspective, Divine Word is insanely good, whether you're using it for Chastise for damage. Sanctify, you could use it if there's consistent damage, kind of like Lore Walker or Stone Step is good, where you can kind of have everybody stack into the healing field. Or if you need to do a lot of triage and spot healing, using it on Serenity works great as well. There's going to be different situations that demand that across the board, and Divine Word is always a flexible and useful option. A lot of your Harmonious Apparatus value will come from using Imperial Blaze. At least at the moment, if you spell queue, if you are casting a Holy Fire and you're instantly mashing the Imperial Blaze button, it's likely that you're going to lose out on a charge of this ability. So make sure that you have a little bit of daylight, take an extra fraction of a second after your casted spell before you cast Imperial Blaze. That's one of the bugs going on at the moment, and it's really frustrating to deal with, but definitely keep it in mind when you're utilizing your spells. I almost never cast Renew unless I'm like running from trash pack to trash pack. Renewed Faith is just to allow you to get to Enlightenment, and then from there into Symbol of Hope. A lot of the gameplay in dungeons and the challenge that Holy Priest is going to have in dungeons is not anything related to mana. Your ability to sustain high output throughout very lengthy encounters like you would see at a Ner'zhul, for example, in Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, is insanely high. The challenge that Holy Priest is going to have is the last fight of Court of Stars, Advisor Melandris, I believe it's called. It'll be the storm from Hirja in Halls of Valor. It'll be all about lots of burst output. Holy Priest is not extremely well equipped to handle that burst. You've got your Divine Word, you've got your Apotheosis. You have a couple of resources to help you accelerate your Holy Word generation or make them more valuable to reverse that incoming damage, but there is such an incredibly high value I would put on haste for the spec in dungeons because it allows you to more rapidly respond to the incoming pressure, and it makes a massive impact on your overall healing when you can quickly react to that damage. Even though Perf Healing is going to heal everybody equally, it's not well equipped to help you do a lot of healing in a bursty format. And so as a result, you're kind of picking away at the most vulnerable allies with lots of single target healing to be able to get the job done. On an encounter like Advisor Melandris, you should always have a lot of cooldown reduction, damage reduction from things like Protective Light on your class tree, from reduced cooldown out of Fade, and you can even run with Desperate Prayer supporting talents like Light's Inspiration to give you more breathing room to help your own survivability. With that, you can then start focusing other allies and using Guardian Spirit as a helpful external onto maybe Hunters or maybe onto, say like Evokers, for example, who may not be as tanky as you or who may be way less tanky than you, and they're going to need a lot of extra spot healing. And so what I like to do whenever I have a lot of burst party damage is lean on my group and look at who has certain immunities that I can take advantage of. When can the Hunter, for example, utilize Turtle? When can a Rogue use Cloak or Evasion or whatever it is to make sure that they survive? Because when I know that they're using that ability, that's one less person out of 5, really, that I would need to heal. A lot of burst damage out of things like Advisor Melandris, for example, will deal something along the lines of like 100% of your health over the course of the burst, or 130 or 140%, which means you just need to heal anywhere from 1% of somebody's life to 30 or 40% to allow them to survive hits. And so if you can't heal everybody at once, that means you have to trim who you're focusing on healing. And with that, you say, okay, well, the Hunter's going to use their Turtle on this one. I don't need to heal them there. I'm going to focus on myself and this other person that's vulnerable. And you can continue cycling it from that point. If, for example, nobody has great defensive personals, leaning on things like Darkness, leaning on things like Rallying Cry, AMZs where they're necessary, all of these help smooth out all of the damage that the party is taking, and then allows you to, again, find who's going to have the lowest baseline damage reduction, and then focus heal them a little more than everybody else. Symbol of Hope, similarly, is incredibly helpful. Being able to use Desperate Prayer onto yourself and it taking a minute off of that helps a lot. Being able to time when you use your resources to, say, get a Hunter's Exil back, a Demon Hunter's Blur, you name it. There's a number of different abilities that can allow you to ignore or almost entirely ignore certain players when you're in these challenging, difficult, tyrannical boss fights. When it comes to using Apotheosis, a lot of times I like to be able to get back-to-back Sanctifies if there's a lot of burst damage, but often that's not enough when you get to higher key levels. So usually I will use it for double Serenities. And so I will Serenity, Apotheosis, Serenity again. Or if I don't have my Holy Word back yet, I will preemptively Apotheosis, hit a really powerful Serenity onto a target, and then build up a second one that I can quickly dump into somebody else who's also dropping low. Powered Life, always you want to be able to use it when someone's 35% health or lower. It's great to be able to mix in all the time. But it's always challenging because you don't know if somebody's going to survive the next incoming hit or die to it to allow you to properly min-max that ability. So the more knowledge that you have of the consistent damage happening on a lot of boss encounters is going to be extremely important. The first boss at a Ruby Life Pools, for example, you know that whoever goes into the Wind Tornado is going to take a crazy amount of damage. And so focus healing that person, but also being mindful that it's going to deal a heavy burst of damage to you, and then kind of gauging how much damage comes at the beginning of the fight, whether it's going to be 40% of your life or 50% of your life, and then making sure you and your allies are above that threshold makes a world of difference in how you prioritize your healing, and then you're going to be able to weave in extra damage as needed. Otherwise, if you guys have any other questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. I'll also be working on an advanced Holy Priest guide to go over a variety of specific boss encounters that I know are going to be very challenging. I mentioned some of them in this video, but we can break down even more. So if you have specific bosses that are giving you a lot of trouble, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And otherwise, any other questions that I might have missed out on, or I can point you in the right direction for future content, also feel free to let me know. Big thank you to all our Twitch subscribers who are making all of this content possible. If you'd like to be able to join, check out our live stream. Once again, linked in the description, as we'll be doing lots of rating, M+, high-end content with both Holy and Disc Priest, and maybe a bit of Evoker as well. So be sure to check it out now that we're home from the Race to World First. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.